Some questions should never escape your lips. Questions whose answers lie buried beneath generations of silence, concealed behind locked doors and letters reduced to ash. Questions that, once voiced, unravel entire existences like thread yanked from decaying cloth. In the spring of 1847, a young enslaved woman named Dinah posed such a question. She asked it just once, her voice scarcely rising above a whisper, standing in the doorway of the plantation kitchen. The man she questioned, the overseer, a savage figure named Horace Vance, was discovered 3 days later suspended from the oak tree behind the stables, his own belt cinched around his neck, his face frozen in an expression witnesses would later describe as knowing. But Dinah's question refused to die with Vance. It spread through the quarters like contagion, whispered among the tobacco rows, murmured over evening fires, and as it proliferated, other secrets began surfacing. Secrets meticulously maintained for nearly 20 years. Secrets involving the master's bloodline, the genealogy of the plantation, and a truth so profoundly disturbing it would ultimately consume everyone who encountered it. This is the account of Thornhill Plantation in Loudoun County, Virginia, where a simple observation about resemblance became a death sentence, and where the answer revealed a horror surpassing anyone's darkest imaginings. Before we continue with what happened at Thornhill and the question that obliterated it, I need you to do something. If this opening has already sent chills down your spine, hit that subscribe button immediately and activate notifications, because stories like this one, buried deep in America's most shameful history, are what we excavate here every week. And I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now let's discover what Dinah witnessed that spring morning and why her question could never be answered safely. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of Virginia's undulating Piedmont region. Its main house was a 3-story Georgian structure with white columns that gleamed brilliantly under the afternoon sun. The estate occupied land that had once served as hunting grounds for the Saponi people, before they were forced westward by colonial expansion. By 1798, when Colonel James Fairchild purchased the property with tobacco trade profits, no trace of the original inhabitants remained except for the occasional arrowhead unearthed by a plow. The plantation had been Fairchild property for nearly half a century when our story begins. Colonel James had constructed the main house in 1802, importing craftsmen from Richmond to create a structure that would announce the family's status to anyone passing by. The house featured a grand entrance hall with a sweeping staircase, parlors on either side with marble fireplaces, a formal dining room accommodating 20 guests, and upstairs, 6 bedrooms with tall windows overlooking tobacco fields stretching toward the river. Behind the main house stood the dependencies, the kitchen house built separately to minimize fire risk, the smokehouse where meat was cured, the dairy with its cool stone floor, the laundry where enslaved women spent their days over steaming tubs, the carriage house and stables, the overseer's cottage, and beyond all of these, arranged in 2 rows, stood the slave quarters, rough wooden cabins with dirt floors and stone chimneys, each housing anywhere from 4 to 8 people. Colonel James Fairchild had died in 1825, leaving the plantation to his son, Edward's father, also named James. This second James Fairchild had managed Thornhill for 7 years before dying suddenly in 1832 of what the doctor termed apoplexy, a stroke that claimed him in the middle of the night, leaving him cold in his bed by morning. He was 41 years old. Edward Fairchild, then just 28, had inherited everything: the land, the house, the debts, and the 47 human beings whose names were listed in the estate inventory between the livestock and the furniture. He'd been married for 3 years to Catherine Whitfield, daughter of a Richmond merchant, and they had 1 infant daughter who would die of scarlet fever before her 2nd birthday. By 1847, Edward was 43 years old and looked older. His hair, once dark brown, had gone mostly gray. His face carried the weathered quality of a man who spent his days outdoors inspecting fields and reviewing accounts. He wasn't a tall man, perhaps 5 feet 9 inches, but he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone conscious of his authority. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in certain lights, and they rarely showed emotion. Catherine had died in 1838, giving birth to their only surviving child, a boy named Thomas. The birth had been difficult, lasting nearly 2 days, and Catherine had bled too much afterward. The doctor from town had done what he could, but infection set in. She lasted a week, feverish and delirious, calling for her mother and crying about things that made no sense. Edward had sat with her every night, holding her hand, saying nothing. When she finally died, he had her buried in the family cemetery on the hill behind the house, beneath a marble stone carved with angels. Thomas was now 9 years old, a thin boy with his father's pale eyes and his mother's delicate features. He was being educated by a tutor from Richmond, a stern Presbyterian named Mr. Gaines, who believed in Latin, mathematics, and the rod. The boy showed aptitude for learning but little enthusiasm. He spent his free hours reading in the library or wandering the grounds, always alone, always quiet. The plantation's enslaved population numbered 47 souls that spring of 1847. The number fluctuated, births and deaths, occasional sales and purchases, but it had remained close to 50 for the past 15 years. Most worked the tobacco fields that stretched from the main house to the river, their days measured by the sun's arc and the overseer's watch. Tobacco was demanding, requiring constant attention from planting in April through harvest in September. Even in winter there was work, stripping leaves, preparing beds for the next year's crop, repairing equipment. Others worked in the house, the stables, the smithy, the kitchen. There was a hierarchy among the enslaved people, as there always was. House servants looked down on field workers. Skilled craftsmen held higher status than common laborers. Those born on the plantation felt superior to those purchased from elsewhere. But these distinctions meant little in the end. They were all property, all subject to the same absolute power, all vulnerable to the same casual cruelties. Dinah was 19 years old that April, born on the plantation to a woman named Ruth, who had died of fever when Dinah was 12. Ruth had worked in the main house as a chambermaid, responsible for cleaning the bedrooms, changing linens, emptying chamber pots, and attending to the personal needs of the family. She had been a quiet woman, Dinah remembered, with sad eyes and gentle hands. She had taught Dinah to read, secretly, dangerously, using a Bible she'd somehow acquired, and had told her daughter stories about her own mother, who had been brought from Africa as a child, and who remembered the ocean crossing in nightmares that lasted her whole life. Ruth had died in the summer of 1840 during a fever outbreak that killed 6 people on the plantation. Dinah, then 12 years old, had nursed her mother through the final days, wiping her burning forehead with cool cloths, giving her sips of water, listening to her delirious ramblings. In those final hours, Ruth had said things that made no sense to the child Dinah. Apologies, warnings, names that meant nothing. She had gripped Dinah's hand with surprising strength and whispered something that would haunt her daughter forever. "Don't let them make you like me. Don't let them take what they took from me." Dinah hadn't understood then. She understood now. After Ruth's death, Dinah had been moved to the kitchen to work under Bess, an older woman who had cooked for the Fairchilds for 30 years. Bess was perhaps 60 years old. She didn't know exactly, as enslaved people rarely knew their precise ages. With gray hair she kept wrapped in a cloth, and hands scarred from decades of burns and cuts. She was the closest thing to a mother Dinah had after Ruth died, teaching her to cook, to manage the kitchen's routines, to navigate the dangerous waters of serving white people who could punish you for any perceived slight. Dinah was quick with her hands, quiet in her manner, and possessed of unusually keen powers of observation, a trait that would prove both gift and curse. She noticed things, the way Edward Fairchild's jaw tightened when he was angry, the way Mr. Gaines's eyes lingered on the younger enslaved women, the way Horace Vance seemed to take pleasure in others' fear. She noticed patterns, connections, resemblances. She had a brother named Samuel, 2 years younger, who worked in the stables. Samuel had been born in the summer of 1830, and from early childhood had been marked by his unusual appearance. While most of the enslaved people at Thornhill bore the deep brown skin common to their West African ancestry, Samuel's complexion was noticeably lighter, what was sometimes called bright in the parlance of the time, or more cruelly, yellow. His features too were different, a narrow nose, thin lips, and those same pale gray eyes that marked the Fairchild bloodline. Such things were not uncommon on plantations throughout the South. Everyone knew what they meant, though no one spoke of it directly. Mixed-race children were a visible reminder of the violence and exploitation that undergirded the entire system, and their presence was managed through silence and deliberate ignorance. Masters didn't acknowledge their enslaved children. White wives pretended not to notice, and the enslaved people themselves learned to keep silent because speaking the truth could get you sold away or worse. But Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family was more than a matter of coloring. As he grew from boy to young man, the similarity became impossible to ignore. He had Edward's build, tall and lean with broad shoulders and long limbs. He had Edward's way of tilting his head when listening, as though considering what was being said from multiple angles. He had Edward's long fingers, Edward's straight posture, Edward's habit of rubbing his jaw when thinking. By 1847, at 17 years old, Samuel looked like he could have been Edward's son, which, of course, he was, though not Edward's son exactly. Everyone at Thornhill knew it. The enslaved people had known since Samuel was a child, had watched Ruth's shame and silence, had understood the implications. They knew that Ruth had been young and pretty when the old master, Edward's father, had taken notice of her. They knew that she'd had no choice, that no was not a word enslaved women could say to white men. They knew that Samuel was the result, and that Ruth had carried that burden until it killed her. Even the white workers, the overseer, the tutor, the occasional merchants who visited, must have noticed. How could they not? Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family was written on his face, in his build, in his mannerisms. But knowing and speaking were different things entirely. The system depended on this silence. As long as no one said it aloud, as long as the truth remained unspoken, the fiction could be maintained. Edward could continue as master, Samuel could continue as property, and the fundamental lie at the heart of the plantation could persist. The lie that said blood didn't matter, that family didn't matter, that a man could own his own brother and it was perfectly legal, perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable until Dinah asked her question. The morning of April 23rd, 1847, began like any other. Dinah rose before dawn in the small cabin she shared with 3 other women: Mary, who worked in the laundry, Patience, who worked in the fields, and old Aunt Sarah, who was too old for heavy work now and spent her days mending clothes and watching the small children while their mothers worked. The cabin was perhaps 12 feet square with a dirt floor and a single window covered with oiled paper. There were 2 narrow beds, rough wooden frames with rope supports and straw mattresses, and a fireplace where they cooked their own meals when they had time and ingredients. Dinah dressed in the dark, pulling on the same dress she wore every day. Rough homespun cotton, dyed brown, mended in a dozen places. She wrapped her hair in a cloth, slipped her feet into worn shoes, and made her way through the on darkness to the kitchen house. The path from the quarters to the kitchen was well worn, a track through the grass that hundreds of feet had traveled thousands of times. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and growing things. Spring had come early that year, and the trees were already fully leafed, their branches dark against the lightening sky. Birds were beginning to sing, mocking birds and cardinals and the harsh call of crows. Bess was already in the kitchen when Dinah arrived, as she always was. The older woman seemed to need less sleep as she aged, rising earlier and earlier, as though trying to stretch her remaining days. She had already built up the fire in the great hearth, and the kitchen was warming, the smell of wood smoke mixing with the lingering scent of yesterday's cooking. "Morning, child," Bess said without looking up from the dough she was kneading. "Morning, Aunt Bess." They worked in comfortable silence as they did most mornings. Bess kneaded bread while Dinah fetched water from the well, filled the large kettle and hung it over the fire to heat, brought in eggs from the henhouse, sliced ham from the joint hanging in the smokehouse. The kitchen was a separate building, perhaps 20 feet from the main house, connected by a covered walkway. It was built of brick with a slate roof, designed to contain any fire that might start. The main room held the enormous fireplace with its array of hooks and cranes, a long work table, shelves of dishes and pots, barrels of flour and cornmeal, strings of onions and dried peppers hanging from the rafters. By 6 o'clock, they were preparing the breakfast that would be carried to the main house: biscuits, ham, eggs, coffee, preserves made from last summer's peaches. Young Thomas took his breakfast in the dining room with his tutor at 7 sharp. This was Mr. Gaines's rule, part of the discipline he believed essential for a boy's education. Edward ate later, usually around 8, in his study while reviewing the plantation's account books. The routine was invariable, had been the same for years. Dinah could have performed her tasks in her sleep, and sometimes felt that she did, moving through the motions while her mind wandered elsewhere. This morning, though, she was thinking about Samuel. Her brother had been in trouble again. 2 days ago, he'd been caught near the main house after dark, where enslaved people had no business being after the workday ended. He claimed he'd been looking for a lost tool, but Horace Vance didn't believe him, or didn't care whether it was true. The overseer had announced that Samuel would receive 10 lashes as punishment, to be administered this afternoon in front of the other enslaved people, as a lesson. 10 lashes. Dinah had seen whippings before, had heard the crack of the whip and the cries of pain, had seen the bloody stripes left on backs. 10 lashes wasn't the worst. Some people received 50, 100, beatings that left them unable to work for days. But 10 was enough to scar, enough to hurt, enough to humiliate. And for what? For walking near the house that his own father owned. For existing in a space where his presence reminded everyone of the truth they all pretended not to know. Around 8 o'clock, Dinah was carrying a tray of fresh biscuits from the kitchen to the main house, when she encountered Horace Vance on the path. The overseer was a thick-bodied man of perhaps 50, with a red face perpetually flushed from drink and sun, and small eyes that seemed always to be calculating. He wore rough work clothes, canvas trousers, a homespun shirt, heavy boots, and carried a short whip coiled at his belt. Not the long whip used in the fields for driving workers, but a personal implement he used for what he called correction. Vance had been overseer at Thornhill for 8 years, hired by Edward after the previous overseer died of a heart attack. He was efficient, brutal, and utterly without sentiment. He saw the enslaved people as livestock to be managed, and he managed them with fear. He had a reputation throughout the county as a hard man, someone who could handle difficult slaves, and Edward paid him well for his services. Vance stopped Dinah on the path, his bulk blocking her way. He looked at the tray she carried, then at her face, his small eyes moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Morning, Dinah," he said, his voice carrying a false friendliness that was somehow worse than open hostility. "Morning, Mr. Vance." She kept her eyes down as was expected. He reached out and took a biscuit from the tray without asking, bit into it, chewed slowly, crumbs caught in his beard. He was standing close enough that she could smell him. Sweat and tobacco and something sour. "Your brother's getting his lashes this afternoon," Vance said conversationally. 3 o'clock by the tobacco sheds. "You'll be there to watch, I expect." It wasn't a question. When punishment was administered, everyone was expected to watch. It was part of the lesson. "Yes, sir," Dinah said quietly. "Good." Vance took another bite of biscuit. Boy needs to learn his place. Getting too big for his britches. Thinking he can wander where he pleases. "Can't have that. Got to maintain order. You understand?" "Yes, sir. Your mama understood that." Ruth knew her place, knew how things worked. "You do well to be like her." He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Pretty girl like you, smart girl. You could do well here if you keep your head down and your mouth shut." The implication was clear, and it made Dinah's stomach turn. She said nothing, just stood there holding the tray, waiting for him to move. Finally, Vance stepped aside. "Better get those biscuits to the house before they get cold. Master Edward don't like cold biscuits." Dinah hurried past him, her heart pounding. She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked toward the house. She entered through the back door into the warming kitchen, a small room where food was kept hot before serving. From there, a narrow hallway led past the butler's pantry to the dining room. As she approached with the tray, she heard voices. Thomas and his tutor, Mr. Gaines. The dining room door stood slightly ajar. Dinah paused, not from curiosity, but from training. Servants learned to pause before entering rooms, to listen for a moment, to gauge the mood, to avoid interrupting at an inopportune moment, to make themselves invisible until needed. Through the gap she could see Thomas seated at the long mahogany table, his Latin primer open before him. The book looked enormous in front of the small boy, its pages covered in dense text. Mr. Gaines stood beside him, one hand on the back of Thomas's chair, the other pointing to something on the page. The tutor was a thin man of perhaps 40, with a narrow face and dark hair combed severely back. He wore a black suit, as he always did, and carried himself with the rigid certainty of a man who believed he knew God's will. Again, Mr. Gaines was saying, the conjugation, first person singular, present tense. Thomas's young voice, hesitant, "Ammo, louder, speak with confidence, ammo, amas, amat." The morning light from the tall windows fell across Thomas's face, illuminating his profile. The sharp nose, the pale eyes, the thin mouth, the way his hair fell across his forehead. He was wearing a white shirt with a stiff collar, dark trousers, shoes that had been polished to a shine. A child dressed as a small adult, being molded into the master he would someday become. And in that moment, Dinah thought of her brother. Thought of Samuel, who at this very moment was probably mucking out stalls in the stable, his hands rough and calloused, his clothes stained with manure and sweat. Samuel, who would be whipped that afternoon for the crime of walking near the house that his own father owned. Samuel, who had the same pale gray eyes as the boy sitting at that table, the same sharp nose, the same way of tilting his head. The resemblance was striking. It always had been. But somehow, in this moment, with the morning light falling just so across Thomas's face, it was undeniable. They could have been brothers. They were brothers, half brothers, sharing a grandfather, sharing Fairchild blood. But one sat at a mahogany table learning Latin, destined to inherit land and wealth and power, and the other cleaned stables and would be whipped for walking in the wrong place. The anger came suddenly, unexpectedly, a hot surge that rose from her chest to her throat. It was not a planned thing, not a calculated risk. It was simply the breaking point of years of accumulated silence. Years of watching her mother's sadness. Years of seeing Samuel treated as property while bearing the face of the family that owned him. Years of swallowing truths that everyone knew but no one could say. Dinah pushed open the door and entered with the tray. Mr. Gaines glanced at her with the blank expression, white people reserved for servants, seeing her function but not her face, acknowledging her presence only as one might acknowledge a piece of furniture that had moved. Thomas didn't look up from his book, still focused on his Latin conjugations. Dinah set the tray on the sideboard and began arranging the biscuits on a serving plate. Her hands were shaking slightly, though she tried to control them. The anger was still there, hot and insistent, demanding release. And then, in a voice that was quiet but perfectly clear, she said something that would change everything. "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" The room became very still. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to disperse, impossible to ignore. Dinah continued arranging the biscuits, her hands moving automatically, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Mr. Gaines turned slowly. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "What did you say?" His voice was low, dangerous, barely controlled. Dinah didn't repeat it. She didn't need to. The question had been heard, had been understood, and now it existed in the world, real and undeniable. Thomas looked up from his Latin primer, his young face confused. "Which brother?" he asked with the innocent directness of a 9-year-old who didn't yet understand why this question was forbidden. "Who does she mean? I didn't know she had a brother." Mr. Gaines's face had gone from pale to red. He took a step toward Dinah, one hand raised, then seemed to think better of it. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly beneath his black suit. "Get out," he said very quietly. "Get out now." Dinah left the tray, left the biscuits half arranged, left the room. She walked through the hallway, through the warming kitchen, out the back door. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, as though she were watching herself from a distance. She crossed the yard to the kitchen house and went inside, closing the door behind her. Bess was at the work table, rolling out dough for pies. She took one look at Dinah's face and set down her rolling pin. "Child, what did you do?" Dinah couldn't answer. She sat down on the kitchen's back step in the doorway and waited for the consequences to arrive. Her hands were still shaking. She clasped them together in her lap and stared at them, at the brown skin and calloused palms, at the hands that looked like her mother's hands. What had she done? She had spoken the truth. That was all. She had asked a simple question, pointed out a simple fact. "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" But she knew, even as she sat there, that there was nothing simple about it. She had violated the fundamental rule. She had named the thing that must never be named. She had torn away the veil of silence that allowed the system to function, and now she would pay for it. Bess came and sat beside her on the step. The older woman didn't say anything, just sat there, her presence a comfort. They waited together in silence, listening to the sounds of the plantation waking up. Voices calling, tools clanging, the distant lowing of cattle. After perhaps 20 minutes, they heard footsteps approaching, heavy boots on the path. Dinah knew who it was before she looked up. Horace Vance appeared at the kitchen door, his face redder than usual, his small eyes bright with something that might have been anger or might have been excitement. He was breathing hard, as though he'd been running. "You," he said, pointing at Dinah, "come with me, now." Bess stood up quickly. "Mr. Vance, sir, she didn't mean nothing. She's just a foolish girl who don't know when to keep quiet." "I said come with me." Vance's hand moved to the whip at his belt, his fingers caressing the coiled leather. Dinah stood. Her legs were steadier now, her mind clearer. Whatever was going to happen would happen. There was no point in resisting, no point in running. She had nowhere to run to. She followed Vance out of the kitchen, leaving Bess standing in the doorway, her face stricken. They walked not toward the whipping post near the tobacco sheds, as Dinah had expected, but toward the main house. Vance led her around to the front entrance, something enslaved people never used, and up the steps to the wide porch with its white columns. The front door was massive, made of dark wood with brass fittings. Vance opened it without knocking and pushed Dinah inside. The entrance hall was dim and cool after the bright morning sun. Dinah had been in this space before, of course, but always as a servant, always invisible, always moving quickly through on her way to perform some task. Now, being marched through by the overseer, she felt exposed, wrong, like a piece of furniture moved to an inappropriate place. The hall was grand. A black and white checkered marble floor, a curving staircase with an ornate banister, a crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling, portraits of Fairchild ancestors on the walls. To the left was the parlor, to the right the library, and straight ahead past the staircase was the door to Edward Fairchild's study. Vance brought her to that door and knocked sharply. Enter. The study was a large room lined with books, dominated by a massive desk of dark wood. Edward sat behind it, his hands folded on the leather surface, his expression unreadable. Mr. Gaines stood to one side, his face still pale, his hands clasped in front of him. The room smelled of leather and tobacco and old paper. Vance pushed Dinah forward into the center of the room, positioning her in front of the desk like a prisoner before a judge. "This is the one, sir," Vance said. "The one who spoke out of turn this morning." Edward looked at Dinah for a long moment. His pale gray eyes, Samuel's eyes, showed nothing. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, that suggested controlled fury. "Repeat what you said." Edward's voice was level, quiet, but it carried absolute authority. Dinah's mouth was dry. She tried to speak and couldn't. Her tongue felt thick, useless. "I said repeat it." Edward's voice remained level, but something cold moved beneath it, like ice beneath still water. "I asked." Dinah's voice came out as a whisper. She swallowed and tried again. "I asked why young master looks like my brother." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Vance seemed to hold his breath. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. Then Edward said, very quietly, "Which brother?" "Samuel, sir. Samuel, who works in the stables." Edward's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or resignation. He looked at Mr. Gaines. "You heard this." "I did, sir." In front of young Master Thomas, the boy asked questions. He wanted to know who she meant, said he didn't know she had a brother. Edward nodded slowly. He was still looking at Dinah, his gaze steady and cold. "And what did you hope to accomplish with this question? What did you think would happen?" Dinah didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer. She hadn't thought about consequences. Hadn't planned anything. She had simply spoken. "Do you understand what you've done?" Edward continued. "Do you understand that you've disrupted the order of this household? That you've planted ideas in my son's mind that he's too young to comprehend? That you've violated every rule of proper conduct?" Still, Dinah said nothing. What could she say? That the question had been burning in her mind for years. That she was tired of the lie. That she wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge the truth. Edward stood up from his desk, walked around it, and approached her. He wasn't a tall man, but standing this close, he seemed to tower over her. She could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the tightness of his mouth. "Your mother knew her place," he said quietly. "Ruth understood how things worked. She never caused trouble, never spoke out of turn. She accepted her lot and lived her life accordingly." He paused, and something cold entered his eyes. "You would do well to follow her example." The mention of her mother sparked something in Dinah, something that overcame fear, that pushed past caution. "My mother died sad and silent," she said, her voice stronger now. "She carried secrets that ate her from the inside. Is that what you want? More silence, more secrets?" Edward's hand moved so fast she didn't see it coming. The slap caught her across the face, snapping her head to the side, making her ears ring. She tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "You will not speak to me in that tone," Edward said, his voice still quiet, still controlled. "You will not question me. You are property. You exist at my sufferance, do you understand?" Dinah said nothing, just stood there with her hand pressed to her burning cheek. Edward turned to Vance. "Take her to the root cellar, lock her in. I'll decide her punishment later." As Vance grabbed Dinah's arm and pulled her toward the door, Edward added something that made her blood run cold. "And bring Samuel to me. Now." The root cellar was accessed through a heavy wooden door set at an angle against the ground behind the kitchen house. Vance pulled it open, revealing stone steps leading down into darkness. He shoved Dinah toward the opening. "Down you go," he said. Dinah descended the steps carefully, her eyes adjusting slowly to the dimness. The cellar was perhaps 10 feet square, with a low ceiling supported by wooden beams. The walls were stone, cool and damp. The floor was packed earth. Shelves lined the walls, holding barrels of apples and potatoes, crocks of preserved vegetables, hanging bunches of dried herbs. The air smelled of earth and vegetables and something faintly rotten. Vance followed her down, holding a lantern. He hung it on a hook, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then he looked at her, his small eyes moving over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "You know," he said conversationally, "you're a pretty girl. Smart too. It's a shame you don't know when to keep your mouth shut." He took a step closer. "Things could go easier for you if you were friendlier." Dinah backed away until she hit the stone wall. "Mr. Vance, please hush now." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers rough against her skin. "No need to be scared. I'm just saying. You be nice to me, I'll be nice to you. I could talk to Master Edward, tell him you're sorry, tell him it won't happen again. I got influence here." Dinah turned her face away from his touch. "Please don't." Vance's expression hardened. "You think you're too good for me. That's it. You think because you can read and work in the house that you're better than the others." His hand moved to her throat, not squeezing but resting there, a threat. "You're nothing. You're property. And you just made the biggest mistake of your life." He held her there for a moment longer, his hand on her throat, his face close to hers. Then he stepped back, picked up the lantern, and headed for the steps. "You think about what I said," he called back. "Think about whether you want a friend or an enemy." He climbed the steps and slammed the door shut. Dinah heard the heavy bolt slide into place, locking her in. The darkness was absolute. The cellar had no windows, no source of light except what came through the cracks around the door, and that was minimal. Dinah stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, but there was nothing to adjust to. The darkness was complete. She felt her way along the wall until she found a corner, then sat down on the dirt floor, her back against the cold stone. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself small. And she waited. Time passed strangely in the darkness. Without light, without sound except the faint creaking of the floorboards above, Dinah lost track of how long she'd been there. It might have been an hour, might have been 3. Her eyes played tricks on her, showing her shapes and shadows that weren't there. Her mind wandered, drifting between memory and imagination. She thought about her mother, about Ruth's final days. The fever had come on suddenly, as it often did. One day Ruth had been fine, working in the house as usual. The next day she was burning up, delirious, unable to stand. Dinah had been 12 years old. Old enough to help nurse her, but too young to understand that her mother was dying.